Okay, is that big Cold War exam breathing down your neck? Feeling that pressure? Don't even worry about it. We've totally got your back. Think of this as your final high-speed cram session. We are going to fly through the absolute must-know terms you need to ace that test. Let's go. You heard that right. For the next few minutes, we're just going to cut through all the noise and focus on the bedrock definitions, the stuff this whole period is built on. No fluff, just the essential info that's going to get you those points.
All right, here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the why this all happened. Then we'll get into America's strategy, see how that spilled over into actual fighting, and then we'll take a quick look behind the Iron Curtain. It's all connected, so let's get into it.
First up, the big one, the foundational conflict. Look, before you can memorize a single date or name, you've got to get your head around the basic question. What even was the Cold War? So here's the most important thing to remember. It was cold for a reason. The two main players, the US and the Soviet Union, never actually went to war with each other, not in a massive direct World War III kind of way. Instead, it was this giant global showdown of ideas, capitalism versus communism, and they fought it with everything but direct combat. We're talking spy games, political power plays, propaganda, and just a whole lot of simmering tension. So, with this new kind of threat, how did the United States decide to handle it? Well, they didn't just wing it. They developed a full-on strategy, a kind of playbook that guided their actions for decades. Let's break down the key moves. Containment. If you're going to remember one word about US policy for your exam, this is it: containment. The whole idea was pretty simple, really. The goal wasn't to go in and destroy the Soviet Union. No, it was just to contain it, to build a wall around communism and stop it from spreading to any new countries. You can think of it like a geopolitical quarantine. So how do you actually do containment? Well, the first big step was the Truman Doctrine. This was President Truman basically drawing a line in the sand and telling the world, hey, if you're a country fighting off a communist takeover, the US will help you out. It started with sending money and military gear to Greece and Turkey, and that move set the stage for how America would act for the rest of the Cold War. But containment wasn't just about military might, it was also about money. That's where the Marshall Plan comes in. It was the economic side of the strategy. The US pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe after World War II, and the thinking behind it was just brilliant. If your country is stable and prosperous, the promises of communism just don't sound that good anymore. And finally, you have the muscle to back it all up: NATO. This was the military alliance that made everything official. It was the US, Canada, and a bunch of Western European countries all making a pact. An attack on one is an attack on all. It was the ultimate show of force, sending a clear message to the Soviets: don't even think about it. Okay, so you've got these two huge, powerful sides with their own alliances and strategies. You just knew it was only a matter of time before all that cold tension was going to flare up into actual hot fighting somewhere in the world. And the first place that happened in a big way was Korea. The Korean War is your textbook example of a proxy war. See, the US and the Soviet Union weren't firing missiles at each other directly, but they were absolutely involved. They each picked a side in someone else's war and poured in weapons, money, and support. It was their way of fighting each other without risking a direct world-ending conflict. So here's how it broke down. You had North Korea, who were communists, getting backed by both communist China and the Soviet Union. And on the other side, you had South Korea, supported by the United States and a whole coalition of United Nations forces. And the result? Well, after years of brutal fighting, basically nothing changed. The war ended in a stalemate, with the country still divided right where it started. So nobody really won. But the war had a huge impact. It proved the Cold War could turn incredibly bloody, and it just made both sides dig in their heels even harder. Now we have to talk about the one thing that made the Cold War truly terrifying, the thing that made it unlike any war before it. I'm talking about the constant threat of total nuclear annihilation. This whole part of the conflict was built on a strategy of pure, absolute fear. The atomic bomb was bad enough, right? But then came the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, and it just changed the game entirely. We are talking about a weapon that was literally 1,000 times more powerful. So when both the US and the Soviets figured out how to build these things, it set off this absolutely insane arms race. Suddenly, the goal wasn't just to have nukes, it was to have more of them and bigger ones than the other guy. And that leads us to this key term, brinkmanship. It's this terrifying political strategy where you push a dangerous situation right to the edge, to the brink of nuclear war, just to see who blinks first.
It's the ultimate game of chicken, but with the fate of the entire world on the line. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the most famous example of this. The world literally held its breath for days.
So, we've talked a lot about what the US and its allies were doing. But for your exam, you've got to understand the full picture. What was going on inside the Soviet Union's sphere of influence?
So let's wrap this up by taking a look inside the communist bloc. It's really easy to just picture it as this one giant unified red blob on a map, but, the truth was a little more complicated than that.
First, you had what were called the satellite nations. These were countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland and East Germany. Now, technically, they were their own countries, but in reality, the Soviet Union called all the shots. Moscow controlled their politics, their economies, everything. For the Soviets, these countries acted as a giant buffer zone, a protective shield between them and the NATO countries in the West.
Now this is a super important point, the kind of detail that gets you a top grade. The communist world was not one big happy family. When Mao Zedong and the communists took over China, it was a huge win for communism globally, but Mao was his own man. Eventually, he had a massive falling out with the Soviet Union. This created a huge split right down the middle of the communist bloc, and China became its own independent superpower.
So, when you walk into that exam, try to remember the big picture. All these terms we've talked about, containment, NATO, proxy wars, brinkmanship, they're not just a random list of facts to memorize. They're all pieces of a giant puzzle. They're all part of this complicated, interconnected global struggle that was built on strategy, fear, and high-stakes gambles.
And here's one last thing to chew on. The Cold War might be over, but its ghost is still around. Things like proxy conflicts, military alliances, spheres of influence, those ideas are still very much alive in the world today. So, how do you see the strategies we just defined still shaping our world? Something to think about. All right, you got this. Good luck on your exam.